Today we're going to be talking about British colonists again, but this time we're going to be talking less about who these people were and why they came over from England, and we're going to be talking more about what ideas they brought with them from England. Because as you remember, the British colonists stuck around longer than the French and the Spanish colonists, and they had the biggest impact on the United States. So, understanding some of the ideas that they brought with them from England will help us understand where we came from in our country. So, first, let's take a look at who came to settle and where they settled. The Puritans and the Pilgrims settled in New England for religious freedom. Remember, they were not allowed to start their own church in England, so they came to New England to start their own new church. The Quakers, Dutch, and Jewish people settled in the middle colonies for trade and farming. Notice that these people didn't come for religious reasons. They came for trade and farming. And it's also important to remember that the Quakers were a very accepting and tolerant people. So they allowed people to come even if they weren't British or even if they weren't Christian. And businessmen and slaves settled in the southern colonies to grow cash crops. In the southern colonies, the soil and weather were so great that instead of just growing crops for food, people grew crops to sell for money. And they used slaves to do most of the work. Now, I want you to sort this information onto your map, putting the information you have about the New England colonies on these lines, Puritans and Pilgrims, information you have about the middle colonies on these lines, Dutch, Jews, Quakers, and so on. And one thing that I want to do is I want to connect where these places are. These colonies up here are the New England colonies. These colonies here are the middle colonies. And these colonies here are the southern colonies. Don't get all sloppy with your pencil. You don't have to do this on your worksheet. I want you to fill in these lines. I just want you to be able to see on your map where these people are actually settling. Puritans and Pilgrims, farthest to the north. Businessmen and slaves, farthest to the south. Now, I want to show you some pictures so you get a good idea of what life was actually like in the British colonies. Here's a picture of a New England town. And in New England towns, remember that religion was very important and church leaders made very strict rules. These two men are being punished for not following the strict rules in their New England town. Some of those rules might be no dancing or no playing games. Life was strict in New England towns. Now, let's move over to the middle colonies. In the middle colonies, people came for trade, and there were many natural resources, so people came from all around to do business there. So, in the middle colonies, you had big cities start to develop. They're not as concerned about religion. They're very good at getting along, even if they come from different backgrounds. This is a picture of New York. Now, the southern colonies, partly because the weather was so good, plants would grow very, very well. And so instead of just growing plants for food, people grew crops for money, and they used slaves to do that. So life in the southern colonies was harsh, with slaves working hard in the hot sun and white business people sitting on their rumps watching them making money. So that should give you a little bit of an idea what life was like in the colonies. But what's the big deal? How did any of these people influence me today? Well, as we said, the British colonies actually stuck around, and the ideas that they brought with them ended up becoming important here in America. So we're going to be looking at some of the big ideas that they brought over from Britain. First is Christianity. The Native Americans were not Christians, so Christianity was new to them. Examples of this are the Pilgrims and the Puritans, who came just to start their own church. Another big idea is self-government. When these people came to America, they were far away from their king. And they had the idea that instead of a king making all the rules, they could make the rules, and they could set up their own government to make their own decisions. Another idea that they brought over with them is voting. That's a way that people can actually govern themselves. They can vote on decisions and leaders. Christianity is something we've already talked about. I want us to move on to self-government and voting. Self-government. The Pilgrims introduced the idea of self-government when they wrote the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was an agreement between all the members of the community, an agreement about how they would behave and how they would make decisions. Think about it. That's a lot like our Constitution that sets up the government and how we will make decisions. Well, the Mayflower Compact was the first document expressing self-government in the colonies. Use this information to fill in the chart that you have on your worksheet about self-government. It's the big idea that people should choose how to make decisions. It was introduced by the Pilgrims and the Mayflower Compact. And our evidence that this is actually important is from the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution starts out, "We the people." That shows that government comes from the people. The people rule themselves. We also call this democracy. Go ahead and write in democracy. That means government by the people. Now, this is the Mayflower Compact. I'll give you about 10 seconds to look over it, circle keywords, and then I'll go over it and underline the parts that I think are important. Go ahead and take a look. Read this silently. Yada, yada, yada. Pause it if you need to. Now, let me show you what I picked out so that you can start looking at what you can pick out to get the main idea in documents like this. So, this is a lot about God and the king. It's kind of introducing where they're coming from. This isn't all that important. I skipped ahead to this part. Having undertaken, and I say for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, they're talking about why. But the point is, having undertaken a voyage to plant the first colony, we combine ourselves together for our better ordering to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. So they came over on a voyage to start a colony, and they combined themselves to order themselves better and make good, just laws for the good of the whole colony. This information tells us what the purpose of the Mayflower Compact is. It's to create a government. They're working together to make laws. They're combining themselves to enact laws. Another key idea that we can learn from the Mayflower Compact is that religion was very important in New England. They're not just talking about government. They also mention God many times in that document. Go ahead and copy this information on your worksheet. Now, the next big idea that was brought over from England by British settlers was voting. And William Penn, a Quaker, believed that voting was the most fair way to make decisions. The big idea of voting is that people should be able to vote on their government leaders. That means they get to choose who is going to make decisions. Introduced by William Penn and the Quakers. Now, he wasn't the first one to come up with the idea of voting, but he was one of the ones who said that this was a good idea. My evidence is the U.S. Constitution. Citizens of the United States have the right to vote, and that cannot be denied by the United States or any other state. So this shows how important this is to American history. So we've talked a little bit about how important these ideas are to American history. Also copy this information to finish up your worksheet.